Hey everybody. So I've done lots and lots of videos where I review movies or TV shows or video games, and I'll continue to do those because I really enjoy them. But I realized there's an entire genre that I have failed to do any reviews of that I partake of every single day. So I want to talk to you today about webcomics. It's one of the ways that I start my day. I've got a little plug-in on my computer called Morning Coffee. I click it and it loads all my webcomics for that day. So I just wanted to spend today talking about 5 different webcomics that I read. These are not my top 5. These 5 are in no particular order. They're just 5 that I think are worthy of sharing. I will say this. All 5 of these have really long archives. So if you are bored at work or something and you need something to read, these will take you a couple weeks to get through if you're really dedicated. So I'll go ahead and include some random images. I'll also say this. For the most part, the images I've grabbed are random. I didn't grab particular comics for particular reasons because, again, they're very long running. But I did grab the first and last comic so you could kind of see the evolution of the art style. So for each comic, the random images, it'll start with the first one, then some random ones, and then the last one you see will be the most recent as of sometime this week. When I recorded this, I grabbed these images. So, with that said, let's go ahead and move on to our first comic. First, we're going to talk about Sluggy Freelance. Sluggy Freelance has been around for 20 years. It is the longest running comic that I'm talking about today. 20 years. And in that 20 years, it's updated almost every day. The artist has sometimes done weekends, more recently he hasn't. But for most of that 20-year run, it is a daily comic. So, Sluggy Freelance starts out kind of stupid. It starts out as a fairly simple gag-driven comic, like any normal comic strip. And the gags are okay. It's nothing spectacular, and the art is really rough. But I find that's true of almost all of these. They all start with really rough art styles that eventually get a lot better. But art style isn't really where Sluggy Freelance shines. The art style does get better. But, I don't know. When I think of really well-drawn comics, Sluggy Freelance is nowhere near the list. What it does excel at is it takes those simple, gag-driven comics and eventually weaves it into an incredibly complex story. The narrative becomes incredibly convoluted and detailed, and I love that. I love when a story has so much going for it, and you're still able to follow it from beginning to end. And Sluggy Freelance does that so well. The characters end up becoming involved in, ghosts trying to take over the world, demons from another dimension trying to come in, there's an evil megacorp, there's a mysterious assassin who keeps coming back from the dead, and all of these very serious plot elements are treated with, often, but not always, with a very lighthearted hand. There are some very emotional ones. It becomes a serio comedy, right? It's a blend of serious and comic effects. I like this complex story. In fact, the story has gotten so complex over the past 20 years that the author will frequently put little links. Every time he puts in a new comic, there will be links to previous comics to remind you, hey, this is the last time you saw this character. What am I talking about in this comic? Well, I'm talking about this event from 5 years ago. So, if you don't mind a little rough art style, and you want a serious story you can really sink your teeth into, Sluggy Freelance. The next one I want to talk to you about is not a narrative-driven comic, because I'm trying to mix it up a little bit. Saturday Morning Breakfast Cereal. Saturday Morning Breakfast Cereal is not narrative at all. Each comic stands alone. There is no plot. There is no storyline. And it starts out, the early comics are very much like The Far Side. Even as far as having, a funny image, and then the real joke is down there at the bottom in text. But it evolves, and Saturday Morning Breakfast cereal ends up getting pretty interesting because you never know what you're going to get. Sometimes you may get a simple joke, a simple play on words, but occasionally he'll do a really, really long comic that's along the lines of, and I'm picking this one, he's done this one, I can't remember how it turns out, but humanity finally developed a button that when they pushed the button, it gave them intense pleasure. And then the comic will just follow what happens to human history from that point. Because of that discovery, this. Because of this. And it'll go on forever. And it's actually all very interesting and very well thought out. And then the next comic will be a fart joke. Or a Batman joke. So I kind of like that because you never know what you're getting. It's usually going to be pretty funny. I will say this. It doesn't have taste or boundaries, so there will be some blasphemy. There's not necessarily a lot of swearing, and there's no nudity, really. There's no nudity. There's not a bunch of swearing that stands out to me, but that never really jumps out at me. But it's a gag a day, but sometimes they're very thoughtful gags. And it also does something that I really like, where if you hover the mouse over the comic for the day, you get an extra punchline. It's the only one. No, there's one other on today's list that does that. But I always enjoy that because I don't know, I feel like you're getting extra value. Again, it ran for 15 years, or has been running for 15 years, and will continue to run for more. So there's a lot. And the art style, it's decent. It's decent. The guy's not doing Monets, but he does a decent job. So, next, something positive. I have an interesting relationship with something positive. My college roommate Daniel loved something positive. He loved it so much that he kept trying to get me to read it, and because he was so insistent, I refused. Not even going to look at it. You are way too into this, dude. I can't. Which may very well be all of your responses upon seeing this video, and that's fine. But I was wrong. I hadn't read the comic before I met the creator of the comic. He did a special panel here in Austin, and I knew Daniel died several years ago, 9-10 years ago. And because he loved this comic so much, and the guy was coming into town, I wanted to meet the guy. And I ended up talking to him about Daniel, because that's exactly what a webcomic artist wants at a panel. They want somebody coming up and talking about their dead friend. But he remembered Daniel, because he had met him at some function. He ended up drawing me a picture of Daniel. And so I went home and read the comic, because it was the least I could do. And I really, really liked it. Again, the art style, not so fancy. It's serviceable. It's good. It's fine. And it does have a narrative, but it's not Sluggy Freelance, where it's ninja assassins and whatnot. It's very much slice of life. It is just following this group of people's lives. And sometimes it takes a really interesting fictional twist. But for the most part, it's just these people's lives. And the very first comic starts with a coat hanger abortion joke, just to give you an idea of where we're going. And I wish Daniel had told me that. I might have read it. But for me, it's a lot like the show Only Fools and Horses, which starts out as a very standard sitcom. But for me, the characters grow and become like real people. They are fully realized characters, so much so that you're now invested in the comic just to see what happens to these people next. You don't so much care, is today going to have a funny punchline, as much as you care about how's my buddy doing today. Let me check in and see what they're up to today. The characters end up feeling very real, and that's a unique skill. It's a unique gift. In fact, I'd say of all the comics I'm talking about today, this is either the most or the second best at creating realistic, believable, fully fleshed out characters. So, that's something positive. It's been running for 16 years now. It was originally supposed to run for 10, and the guy had a plan for how it was going to end with 10. And then he kept going. And I'll say this also, for the creator's sense of humor, every now and again he'll draw like autobiographical comics, just a comic about himself and what's going on in his life. Like, if he hasn't been able to draw for a couple of days, it'll be him drawing a comic and then explaining what happened. And occasionally, when you see him draw one of himself, which doesn't happen all that often, but he's got like a spirit animal that talks to him, that, you know, tries to get him through whatever's going on, and his spirit animal is a razor blade, which I think really speaks to the kind of dark and cynical sense of humor of something positive. So that gives you an idea of what you're in for there. It's Monday through Friday, so a lot. 16 years of Monday through Friday is a lot. Next up is another non-narrative, non-character-driven comic, because I'm mixing it up. XKCD. This one's been running for 11 years. It does not start out like what it becomes. In fact, for the first 20, 30 comics, it's more just this creator experimenting with drawing and putting stuff on the internet. Like, it's not a comic at all. But it becomes one, and when it does, it becomes one of the smartest comics on the internet. The art style is non-existent. It's mostly stick people. There is no narrative. It is most often gag a day. But they are gags related to physics, computer programming, religion, or music. I mean, it's not all highbrow intellectual comedy, but it frequently is. In addition to that, he will on occasion do things that aren't a comic at all. I pulled one specifically. He did land masses based on the popularity of online communities. Basically, all of the online communities that existed at the time, Facebook, MySpace, Friendster, da-da-da-da-da. And he gave them a size based on how popular they are. So the one that people are on the most is the biggest. And he kind of created a fantasy map using those sizes. He's done stuff where he's just pulled text from stuff from like 1920 to 1950. And it's all about people complaining about how nobody talks today because of postage being so cheap. And a lot of the language that he pulls from these old scientific journals parallels almost exactly people complaining about texting and we never communicate anymore. So he'll sometimes do very interesting things like that. It's not always something funny, but it's almost always something interesting. So I really recommend it. It's a lot of fun to check out. Again, it's been running for 11 years. It takes a little while for it to start being a comic, but he really does experiment a lot. There's a couple where he ends up creating, and there's no way I could have posted this and shared it with you, but it's a comic strip of a kid with a really big balloon, and he's flying off, and he goes, wow, the world is bigger than I thought. And then there's the last panel of the comic is about that big on the screen, and you can click and drag it, and it goes on forever. Like, he's created something bigger than you could possibly imagine, and he's actually sketched in all these characters, and you can zoom around and scale over there, and up there at the top of the mountain is somebody doing a funny joke, and if you go deep, deep, deep underground, you might find hidden tunnels with mole men and lava monsters and a couple of funny gags. Like, an entire world. He does stuff like this. He kind of does whatever idea pops into his head, and I really like that. Again, I kind of like that element of not knowing what you're going to get, but knowing it's either going to be funny or thought-provoking. So, XKCD, I recommend. Our last comic is going to take a little while to talk about. I read this originally when it came out. It's been going for 18 years. I read it for a little while, And then I stopped, and I don't know why I stopped. And recently at work, I had a little bit of spare time, so I reread the whole thing. And it's phenomenal. The first problem comes with what to call it. We're going to call it ScaryGoRound. ScaryGoRound actually started as a webcomic called Bobbins. The original Bobbins, the art style is pretty rough. And it's a gag-a-day office sitcom kind of comic. It is nothing special. I don't even necessarily recommend reading Bobbins. I did because I'm a completionist and I have to read something from beginning to end. Where it gets interesting is, at the end of Bobbins, he decides to end the Bobbins and go on to a new project called ScaryGoRound. ScaryGoRound takes place in the same universe, in the same city, with almost all the same characters. There's a couple of exceptions. There's a couple of characters that disappear and don't show up for like 10 years. But it's the same city, and a couple of minor characters become main characters, so the camera shifts focus over here. And it is unique enough. You could start reading ScaryGoRound without reading any of Bobbins, and you're really not going to miss out on anything. Right? You don't need the background on these characters, and I think he did that on purpose. He divided out. ScaryGoRound is a story. It's more serialized. It's mysteries. Like, on the website, the archives are broken down to specific cases. And there's supernatural thrillers, but with a very light-hearted edge to it. It's very comical. Apparently, in the country of Wales, there's a bunch of devil bears running around, and nobody's really shocked by it. It's just like, oh, careful of the devil bears. I like ScaryGoRound. It has two different art styles. Near the end of Bobbins and the beginning of ScaryGoRound, he's using Adobe Illustrator, and it creates a very unique-looking art style that I like a lot, actually. As it evolves, I like it more and more. Then he decides to go back to hand drawing near the end of ScaryGoRound, and it takes me a while to readjust to that. So I'm not a huge fan of it, of the hand drawn near the end of ScaryGoRound. But then ScaryGoRound ends. And I should say, a couple of times in here, he does some more Bobbins strips, with the art style progressing as he's gotten better. So Bobbins keeps popping up from time to time, and you actually have to dig around on his website to figure out how to read Bobbins from here and Bobbins from there, and here's the main story. The Bobbins don't necessarily relate to the main story, they're just fun asides he apparently likes to create from time to time. Near the end of ScaryGoRound, the story becomes more about high school teenagers solving mysteries and having their life. And then the comic ends. And he starts Bad Machinery, which is still running today. I honestly think Bad Machinery is his best work. The characters are more realized, the stories are tighter, the comedy is better, and the art style is much better. Bad Machinery takes place, again, in the same universe. Again, with the same characters, sort of. It's 3 years after the end of ScaryGoRound, and it focuses on mainly these kids who are kid detectives, and it's a group of 3 boys and a group of 3 girls, and sometimes they compete and sometimes they team up. But all the other characters are in the background. They still pop up and they still do things from time to time. They're just not the main characters anymore. Now the characters are these kids. And it's so well written. And that's the one thing I want to say about all of his comics, regardless of what he's calling it. John Allison, the creator, has a very unique way with language. And it's just a delight to read the way he will twist and bend language to fit the situation. In times, he almost reminds me of Tom Robbins, who's one of my favorite authors. You never quite know how he's going to say something, but you're delighted when he does. I deeply respect his ability with language. I'll also say this. So he's got those 3 comics. He also does side projects that spun off of that. There are some characters that leave at the end of ScaryGoRound, and they became a comic book series called Giant Days. Now, I haven't read Giant Days yet. I have an order of Volume 1, a copy of Volume 1 on order at the local comic book store, because I've gotten to the point now where I'll just read anything he writes. Even though he doesn't draw Giant Days, he still writes. And I really... It's very interesting for me to start at Bobbins and go all the way to Bad Machinery and really see the evolution in terms of not just his art style, which I don't know if I just got indoctrinated to it or not, but I really started to enjoy Bad Machinery's art style by the end, like a lot. And it's hand-drawn, which I kind of was put off when he switched over to hand-drawn from Illustrator, but now I really like his hand-drawn style. But also just how well he writes the stories. The dialogue and random bits and pieces, he always writes extremely interesting. He has a fantastic, unique style. But in terms of actually a cohesive narrative, a good, tightly paced story, Bad Machinery is fantastic, and it is fun to go from Bobbins to ScaryGoRound to Bad Machinery and watch it improve along the way, watch it get tighter and better. So, alright, I feel like I've talked about that one. I had to talk about that one longer because it's 3 comics. 4 if you count Giant Days, but I haven't read it yet, so I can't necessarily recommend it. And then little tiny spin-offs, and man, if you want to read everything he's written, you got to be prepared to do some digging on the website. But you can just go next through all of ScaryGoRound without having to jump to other little side projects. I mean, it all makes sense. You don't have to jump around. I just want to read everything he did as he did it, because I'm crazy. So anyway, there are 5 webcomics for you to check out. ScaryGoRound, Bad Machinery, Bobbins has been running for 18 years. I don't remember if I mentioned that or not. So again, there is a lot of reading you can do. There is a lot of time you can sink into these. I'm sorry, or you're welcome, depending on how you feel about sinking a whole bunch of time into webcomics. So that's it. I don't know if I'm going to talk about webcomics again anytime soon, but like I said, I read them every day. I figured I should at least share some. So you got Sluggy Freelance, Something Positive, and ScaryGoRound if you're into narratives and stories and characters. Then you've got Saturday Morning Breakfast Cereal and XKCD if you're into gag a day, but sometimes highbrow, sometimes very highbrow, sometimes not so much. You never know what you're going to get with those two. XKCD, I will say, more often than not, is going to be very intelligent or interestingly experimental. Saturday Morning Breakfast Cereal can be thought-provoking at times, but don't expect it to be, because then you're going to be in for a little bit of a wait. But it is a good read. It's fun. So there you go. Hope you guys enjoy. If you know of any webcomics that you'd like to share with me, by all means. God knows I read enough of them, but I'm willing to read more. I'll see you guys around.